Hi, curious friend. Happy 2026. This is the first episode of the new year. I've been chatting with you guys on socials. I've been getting your emails. You've been really diving into these last couple of episodes. So I'm really excited to continue that train, to continue that great groove we've been on of recording episodes, learning, applying the material in our everyday life. Really just want to kick off saying I'm celebrating whether, this is the first episode you've stumbled across or the maybe 30th, or we're getting close to 30 now. A 30th episode you've listened to of mine, just celebrating all of the learning and integrating that you're doing. You're probably doing a lot more than you think, so just taking a little moment, celebrate. And funnily enough, the episode that we're talking about today, the topic is all about rewarding your brain. The neuroscience perspective of that, what does that really mean at the level of your brain? And then what does that mean in terms of how you run your life and how you build a brain that starts working for you and not against you, and really building circuits that allow you to gain momentum towards the things that you want out of life, whether that's physical things, material things, or inner things, right? Whether that's qualities you wish to instill, feelings that you want more of. And this episode really birthed out of my post on Instagram around what I'm doing differently as a neuroscientist in 2026. And this came out of a comment on my 2024 post. 2025, I guess I had nothing, or I didn't post anything anyway. But in 2024, I said that I was no longer speaking my fears out in the world. And this was really born out of a habit that I have and a habit that many of us have, where if we're stressed about something, as a way to what we think is relieving the stress, we'll tell it to a lot of people, right? So we'll share like, oh, I'm really scared this won't work out once, twice, 3 times a week, maybe once, twice, 3 times a day. I know I was doing this a lot when I was working on my candidacy exam. I was sharing about how stressed out I was about the process, and that I would only feel relief once it was over. And during that experience, I was like, there has to be a better way to do that, but that's a bit of a side tangent. And so the comment was, now that it's been 2 years, do you still stick with that concept? Did that concept actually help you? And is there anything you would add or any changes you would make? And that's where the reward system comes in. So I said what I said. I still holds true today. Super important. We're not constantly reinforcing our fears by saying them over and over again. And this is not an avoidant thing, right? Where we don't say our fears. Because even if we don't say our fears, if we're still that same heightened level of fearful of them, does not saying them out loud actually change anything? No. But to add to that is to begin to reward my brain as I'm building towards the goals I want. Again, the physical and the non-physical goals. And when I shared this and shared the power that it has had on my life so far, the power that it's had on my clients' lives so far, overwhelming question was, how do we do this? They're like, okay, on board, love the science behind it, into it, but how do we actually start doing this? How do you actually genuinely start rewarding your brain? Which is an incredible question. And it's a question that, as we're kicking off 2026, is the episode we're starting the year with. Because if we get a handle on this and we get a grasp on this, things start changing pretty rapidly. And so the way that I'm going to go through this episode is by front loading it with the neuroscience. So some neuroscience principles that'll help you understand what it means in our brain to reward it. What kind of functional and structural consequences in a good way, right? Like what is basically the result of rewarding our brain at the level of the physical, right? So in terms of our circuits and how things are firing. And once we have a good understanding of that, we'll move through on how do we implement it in our day-to-day life. And this is going to be a simple 3-step process that's going to take a few times. It's not something we're going to get right away, and I'll explain why we won't get it right away. It's not that you're defective or broken. It's just simply how our brain is set up. So without further ado, let's get started. There's no way that I could get through this episode without talking about dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is often studied in the context of pleasure, in the context of addiction in particular. Front-loading this episode was saying that dopamine has a lot more functions than simply pleasure, and we'll talk about those as well as they relate to our reward system in the brain, because it also impacts things like motivation and attention. Something that is evolutionarily true with our brain is that we are paying attention to big surges of dopamine. And this is relevant because these big surges are big things of pleasure. But dopamine is involved in saliency, and saliency is basically paying attention to new things. And so a really well-studied example of this, especially in the evolutionary lens, is food. This idea that we get big surges of dopamine when we have really high sweet sugary foods compared to foods that are more relevant for sustaining life long term, like our proteins, like our vegetables. And the reason for this is because, when we were in our hunter-gatherer days, right, it was very rare to come across fruit that had high sugar content that was ripe and ready to go. And so our brain wanted us to be alert and be aware of those scenarios so that we'd be more likely to find them again in the future and kind of inherently know or innately know, yes, like this is something I can eat, this is good for me. And as a result of that, I think at a biological level, what's happened is that we continue to look for those big hits. And those big hits take on different things, right? So the sugary sweets is an example of that. And that's something that the whole dopamine and obesity or overeating disorders looks at quite a bit. But we can think of it around, wanting lots of money all of a sudden, right? So this idea of like winning the lottery, which is partially how people can, get addicted to gambling, can, have a problem with buying lots of lottery tickets compulsively. Is this idea that you get that dopamine surge, like in anticipation of potentially getting that really big hit. We can think about it in terms of views or virality or followers or kind of like taking off all of a sudden on social media. Is this idea that you could have that big hit, that big dopamine surge. And what I want to work towards in kind of talking about the neuroscience behind this is finding a way to redefine reward in our brain, because there's a lot of kind of tricky things that can happen if we're looking for those big hits to feel that reward. Because essentially we assume that we won't be able to feel that reward until we get those big hits, whether it's the millions of dollars, millions of followers. But the reality is that if we wait to feel that reward and we get those things, and if those things come, we won't feel it because we haven't set up the circuitry to support feeling good in the absence of those things. And so I'll talk a bit about, the relationship between attention and reward and how reward works in terms of starting to tune your attention to the right things being the things that you want to build the circuit to support what it is that you want in both the physical and the non-physical space. And so like I mentioned before, dopamine serves as pleasure, as reward in our brain, but it also helps with saliency, paying attention. What is it that I need to be paying attention to? And when your brain is challenged, it is looking at different ways of paying attention. And so a really great example is if you can reflect back on your like grade 3, grade 4, grade 5 days, or maybe you have kids that are in this age range where they're starting to learn math and it's kind of going from the simple to the more complex, right? You have the like multiplication tables, you're starting to do division, maybe long division, if anybody even does long division anymore. But of course, you learn the lesson and then you have homework after. And if you don't do the homework, it's very hard to integrate the lesson, right? That's where that whole like sitting osmosis learning theory doesn't really work. But if you remember correctly, often the homework was structured in a specific way that it would be the easiest questions first and the hardest questions last. And intuitively, you're like, yeah, that makes sense for you to kind of like understand your learning. But in terms of motivation in your brain, it's super important. So as you're kind of understanding the easier questions, and maybe you can reflect back on this, or you've seen this in your kids, when they get the easier question, they're like, I can do the next one. And they continue on that way, right? So the dopamine hits, they're paying attention to the question, they get another hit because they got it. They réussite, we say en français. You know, like they understand that. And then they're willing to go to the next one. And they continue on that way. To the point that when they hit a challenging question, they're still motivated to figure it out. So they do it and they go, oh, I didn't get it. They review their work. They look at their work. They maybe find the problem. Maybe they don't. They go to the back of the book. They see where it is that they made the mistake. They go, that makes sense. And then they're even more motivated to do the next question. So this is this idea of getting a bit of a reward, helping it guide your attention, and helping with that process, and that process being more motivating. If, for example, I was a kid, and maybe I was, that did not do their homework, and then I get, I'm doing review questions for an exam, and I'm like, let me do questions at the back. I know those are going to be the ones worth the most points. Let me focus on that. And I start doing those. Likely what's going to happen is that I'm going to not get it at all, to the point that I'm not even motivated to try. And I'm not motivated to try for a few reasons. One is that I haven't built up that dopamine, right? So I haven't built up the attention. I also haven't built up that reward, right? Which they work together, as you can start to see, right? To fuel me to want to do more questions, to want to expand my learning. It's also a bit of what we call learned helplessness. And this is something that's been studied in many forms, in particular with depression. This idea that you feel so low that you get to that kind of helpless, hopeless state. And your brain has that with learning. If it doesn't have enough of that reward, enough of those réussites or récompenses, none of those kind of like little wins in the bank, it's just going to straight up give up. And does that mean that you give up? No, but it means that we need to start tweaking our reward system to encourage that motivating cycle of paying attention, getting reward, paying attention, getting reward, that wants to continue to propel you forward. And this kind of pathway, or this use of the dopamine system, is something that I've learned a long time ago. It's something I learned in my undergrad, but it isn't something I really, really appreciated until I started my business with brain training. So if you're not aware, brain training using neurofeedback techniques. So that is where we use at-home EEG devices. In the case of my business, the Fire and Rewire program. And you connect this EEG device to an app on your phone, and you're focusing on training a certain brainwave. So let's say we're going to increase alpha brainwave associated with relaxation and reflection. When we increase it a certain amount, which is measured by the EEG, the music on our phone is going to increase along with the increased brainwave. And this is a way for you to know in real time what your brain is doing. And it's an excellent example of how powerful it is to play with our brain's reward system. This is because at the end of your sessions, and so I use it for particular rewiring of stress, building internal resiliency, pairing it with brain reprogramming tools, you get, and we do this in the form of meditations usually, because they've been shown to help a lot with building that internal resiliency, tranquility, managing stress. You get a percentage at the end of your meditation, which is over the course of your meditation, what percentage of the time were you increasing that brainwave. And so each meditation has a threshold, which is basically a line of like, if you train over top of that amount being that power of the brainwave, then we're going to increase the volume. If you're underneath it, we're not going to increase the volume, we're going to decrease the volume. And this is something that has been used in the clinic for a long time. I believe it started with seizures, actually, being able to train synchronous activity in your brain, and it's moved on to ADHD. That's been a really common form of neurofeedback, one of its uses. Expanding to PTSD, anxiety, depression. That percentage number is really important, and that's been studied in the literature, but I also see it in my clients. Basically, if you have a reward rate that is lower than 50, what I see happen is the reward rate usually plummets to like 30, 20, 10%. With that idea, if your brain is not getting enough reward, it's simply going to give up. So whenever I'm working with somebody new and we identify an area of the brain, a brain wave that we're working with that's going to help with their goals, usually the first couple meditations, they plummet. And this is because this is an area to a brain wave that their brain is naturally not increasing, that it's a struggle. So we know we found the area that we're looking for. And I love it when clients have worked with me for a while, they don't see that as a bad thing. They're like, yes, we found it. We found the area, we found the brainwave. And it's incredible because the brain essentially just gives up. But what I see inversely, right, is when we have reward rates that are in the 60, 70, even 80 range, over time, if they're able to hit those numbers over time, the brain wave, that power over time increases, which means that the brain is learning, and it means that the brain is motivated to learn. And this is just such an incredible thing that I think, and we'll talk about what most of us do, because most of us do the opposite of this. Most of us are like beating ourselves up along the way to our goals, to a better life, to a better version of ourselves. And it's just not the right fuel to build that real meaningful change in your brain. But that dance is tricky. That dance of beating yourself up so you are more motivated, or thinking logically, well, if I'm hard on myself, then I'm going to push and propel myself further, versus if I reward myself, then I'm going to be complacent. And what I want to share with you is that at the level of your dopamine system and how your brain is firing, the rewarding yourself versus beating yourself up to get there is biologically almost a continuation of each other. And so if you take a step back and go into the rewarding phase, there are definitely way more benefits to it, but also being kind to yourself if you did go the beat yourself up route, which I have done and I continue to monitor, because if I tip that way for too long, I start experiencing symptoms related to stress, and I start noticing it impact my productivity and my creativity. It's easy to see biologically how you kept going in that direction. And making your way back is maybe not as difficult as you may think. The brain wave associated with learning being tapping into your brain's neuroplastic ability. Neuroplasticity is all about changing the connections in your brain. So it's not about making new cells in your brain. It's all about adjusting the connections you already have to either make them stronger or weaker. It's kind of the blanket neuroplasticity term. I will drop in the show notes below my brain fundamentals episode if you want to dive into that a bit more. And so the brain wave associated with that is beta. Beta is a higher frequency brain wave between like 15 to 35 hertz, which is just firing cycles per second. And it makes sense when we think of this because neuroplasticity has been shown to have activity dependency, meaning that cells that receive a lot of stimulation will begin to adjust their connections so that that entire circuit is stronger, so that it doesn't need as much stimulation to fire entirely. And that's that whole cells fire together, wire together, which is a very important concept, especially when we're thinking about learning. There are others, of course, but this is one big one. In that beta range, so in that brainwave range, they've actually, in studies, have split it up into three. So in the middle is really optimal for learning. The low frequency is optimal for learning as well, but it's kind of more relaxed attention. Even it's involved in emotional regulation, which is fascinating. The high beta is associated with hypervigilance, hyperattention, hyperfocus. And this can kick off your stress response. And what's interesting, right, is that hyper alertness can also kick off that dopamine system, right, that saliency system. The role of dopamine in stress is quite complicated, and there's literature coming out on it now and has been for a while, especially in the context of mental health disorders, stress, mental health related disorders, right? Like generalized anxiety, even depression could be binned under that category, with the idea that there's areas in the brain commonly associated with pleasure, the nucleus accumbens. It's a huge house of dopamine reserves that actually has inputs into our stress response, our HPA axis, which again, I'll put another link in the show notes with the episode that talks more about the different types of stress response we have in our brain. Really great foundations that you can start piecing together how your stress shows up for you and which system impacts you the most. So you can see how it's a bit confusing, right? Or you can see how, let's say you're rewarding yourself, you're paying attention, and you can tip into hypervigilance, right? Where you have that beta brainwave, right? It's associated with learning, making new circuits, but you take it a little bit too far. Or even you have that dopamine that's helping you stay salient, paying attention, then you increase it at even more and you get into hypervigilance state. And then you kick off your stress response, and your stress response is not prioritizing learning more circuits. It's not prioritizing plasticity in that way. It prioritizes changing things to be able to deal with whatever stressor you are confronting, right? And it's releasing different chemicals. It has different changes in your body. It's prioritizing different management in terms of your energy. And so with all this information, like what does it actually mean? What can you take away and what can you start applying to your life today? The shift that I want us to build towards, focus on building, right? Because anything with the brain, there's no such thing as an overnight success when it comes to the brain. It's always small repeated actions, sustainable, consistent, that really helps make long-lasting changes in your brain. It's possible, but we got to be patient, which I know some of you, including myself, don't always love to hear, but it's a great little tidbit when it comes to changing the brain. Once you change what your brain considers to be a reward, you can drastically change your life and you can really tap into the circuits that you want to build versus getting into a hypervigilant state where the only circuit that you're reinforcing or building are the ones that help you keep in your stress response, your fight or flight response. And what this does, and this is again, not something that happens overnight. This is something that we start implementing and we build and we build and we build until what'll feel like all of a sudden, even though you and I know it's not all of a sudden, is you start building circuits and you feel the difference internally. And when you feel that difference internally, whether it's a skill you're building or goals you're making towards a project in the physical world, in the physical space, whether that's work or a creative project, or maybe it's a feeling that you're trying to have, right? Or a quality that you're trying to embody and you're building towards building that internally, the world around you will change. Because your strongest circuits have changed. The way you interpret what's happening around you will change. The opportunities that you see and will be presented will change. It really does change everything. And a really good example of this on how I know my internal circuits are changing, even if externally they're not changing yet. Famous last words, but it's okay, yet. is around this podcast. So this podcast, if I remember correctly, I started maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. And this podcast really came out of, everything I was sharing on social media. I really felt like there wasn't enough space to dive into it properly, especially anything neuroscience related, science related. There's so much nuance to what we talk about. And it's very easy, right, to go the clickbait way of kind of only sharing half the story. And this is sometimes unintentional, right? Because there's just not enough time to give all the context, to teach all the teachings. And then sometimes this is also unintentional because people who are sharing this are passionate about it and excited about it, but don't have the background to be able to understand what the nuance is. And then of course there's intentional, right, where people are only sharing half the story, knowing they're sharing half the story to get views or likes or money, whatever it may be. And I have a very deep desire to share this information because I want to empower people to be able to change their brains on their own. And this idea that we have so much untapped power in our biology that combined with the right tools, intention, and education, that it is completely possible to regulate yourself, not need anything from the outside to do it. And this is not to make people feel bad who use outside things. I am somebody who has in the past used outside things, and I think it's absolutely perfect and was exactly what I needed at the time. But that is completely possible to rewire your brain for ultimate resiliency, to show up as the fullest version of yourself, to be able to comfortably go after exactly what it is that you want out of life without needing something outside of you. And when I started this podcast, I had kind of an upswing, and then, PhD got busy, but I also, to be perfectly honest, got discouraged by the amount of likes, by the amount of views, wondering, is anybody listening? Does anybody care? Is this actually helping anyone? And this led to a bit of a slump. It was hard for me to be motivated to show up and do these episodes, right? Thinking of that math homework example. At some point I was like, well, has my mission changed? Like, do I genuinely feel less motivated to help people feel empowered by their own biology? No, definitely not. Just as motivated, if anything, even more motivated. So I needed to find a way to have that reward system for myself so that I could continue to show up, because one thing's for sure, I'm gonna help nobody. I'm gonna help nobody if I decide to stop showing up. That's a surefire way to make sure that my goal of helping people feel empowered by their own biology is not going to happen. And I redefined, and we'll get into this, I redefined what success and what reward means to me in this case. And so anytime I would get a comment or a DM or a message or somebody I know in person coming up to me being like, hey, I listened to your podcast and it helped me with a blank, or I saw this differently, or I applied this tool and I can't believe how much is changing. That was enough for me. And I saw that as a reward, a huge reward. And I'll get into how we can get there, because I would much rather one person take away one thing from one episode that changes their life a little bit than hundreds and thousands of people listening to the episode, commenting on the episode, but not taking away anything from it and not making any changes or not thinking of something differently or not trying something differently. And it's to the point now, because it was sticky, I'm not gonna lie, it was sticky in the beginning to get there, because there was still that really strong circuit of like, oh, it's one person, it doesn't matter. It does matter. To the point that when I get those comments now, because let's be real, I'm not getting the thousands, 100,000, millions of views, comments, likes. So externally, that hasn't changed. But what has changed is I am starting to get more of those comments. And how I feel about those comments now are different. I feel way more reward, and that reward for me, which will be different for everyone because I don't know if everybody's a crier. I'm a crier. My partner jokes that I'm a sponge. You squeeze me too hard and like water comes out. That when I get those comments, I get a little emotional now. And I get emotional because I know that in a small way their life has changed. And because I was consistent and did not give up in so many ways, they get to experience a slightly different life because of me. And there's many people that have done it for me. I'm sure many people have done it for you, and you've done it for many people, but are you noticing it? Are you noticing it, and are you using that as fuel to reward your brain to continue to build, right? So for me, that's continuing to post, continuing to do these episodes. It's building my communication skills. Can I communicate them better? Can I hone in on topics that are relevant? And can I break them down in a way that people can actually understand them and people can use them right away, right? These are all things that you build with repetition and with kind of that growing, right? When we think of those math problems, right? Getting slightly harder and harder each time. And so if you're still with me, as promised, 3-step process to start reframing what a reward is in your brain. First thing is to regulate your stress. Like I said, right? Neuroplasticity does happen when you're under stress, but honestly in the direction that you don't want it to be. It's not prioritizing learning new skills or finding pleasure or any of those things. It's prioritizing getting your body ready to deal with a stressor. So first things first is to regulate your stress. And I'll link episodes below to help you get started with that. In particular, looking at the level you're at right now for stress regulation, that'll really help manage your expectations and pick what tools make the most sense at that level. And prioritizing that. So that's stress regulation daily, doing something daily to help with that. And once you build towards the levels, also using it in real time. But that's a building process, right? That's not something that's going to happen all at once. And not something I want you to beat yourself up if it doesn't happen all at once. Because it won't. And that's perfect. That's how the brain works. 2 is to get into the underneath of why it is you want what you want. So whether that's the thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, millions of followers, promotion at work, partner, kids, whatever it may be. The idea here is, how is it that you want to feel? And so when I think about this podcast, for example, and when I ask myself that question, I wanted to feel like I was bringing value to the world. I wanted to feel like I was making an impact, but more importantly, value. Value is like my number one, AAA, 110% priority. And when I look at how I'm rewarded now, when somebody tells me they listened to an episode, what they took away, and how it changed their life in a small way, that is adding value. And I wouldn't have known to pair that reward with value if I didn't ask that question of what it is that I want to get underneath having a quote unquote successful podcast. And the last one, which is my favorite one, is a journaling prompt. And this is where every single day, don't roll your eyes, every single day. And again, writing with your brain is so helpful. I have like journals full of scribbles because it's just such great stimulation for your brain. It's really, really powerful. So this exercise is finding evidence every single day, and you can start in your past if you're finding it difficult in the beginning to gather evidence throughout your day on how the work is working. And you can make this more specific to whatever goal you have, right? So if we're using my podcast as an example, or let's use my PhD as an example. So how am I moving forward in my PhD in a positive way every day, right? And this is to counteract, let's say, I was feeling, and I was at one point feeling this, and I really don't feel it anymore, which is incredible, that I was always behind on my PhD and that I wasn't going to make it. And I'll put the link, there's going to be a lot of links of the episode I talk about that and how I kind of shifted out of that. But let's say I want to see how the work is working every day, and my focus is on finishing my PhD. So pulling evidence every day on how I'm doing actions towards completing my PhD, maybe new ideas that popped up that helped me towards completing my PhD. Maybe I notice blocks, right? So let's say I noticed that I was feeling behind and starting to get stressed out. And so I used a stress regulation tool to bring myself back to balance, and it helped me keep writing my thesis. That's an evidence on how the work is working. That is how I'm positively contributing to my PhD thesis. And it's something you do every day. And by pulling evidence, there's no kind of bullshit detector in your brain, which is why affirmations don't work if your brain is really not on board with it, if it really doesn't believe it. By pulling evidence, you're stimulating that circuit. You're not detecting that bullshit meter, a little bullshit thermometer going bing, that's bullshit. And you're doing stimulation every single day, which builds that circuit so that all of a sudden, even though it's not all of a sudden, you feel like that naturally. You don't even need to gather evidence in your day to feel it. It's just a belief that you have. And it's wild, I have to tell you. So this is a belief that This is a belief I had that I was really behind in my PhD and that there was a possibility of me not getting it. And I did some things to help bring myself more to a balanced place, but I wanted to continue to build that belief that, I got things, that I will be able to finish my thesis. There's nothing to actually be afraid of. To the point that this week, my cells are growing very slowly. They're like coming back from Christmas break, very chill. It's like almost the end of January. And instead of freaking out, I was like, this is a great opportunity for me to write. And so I set myself a goal of 30 hours of writing amongst doing business things, amongst taking care of lab related things, amongst, going to the gym, whatever. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to track it. I'm going to track how many hours I do to kind of help quell that feeling of like, I'm not doing enough. And so I'm doing the things. It's Friday. My target was 30 hours a week of writing. I'm at less than 15. And when I saw that, I did not freak out. I did not panic. I did not beat myself up. I still can't believe it. I did not beat myself up. I looked at that and I was like, but I'm really happy with my progress. Like everything I did writing wise this week propelled me forward in terms of completing my PhD. And the ideas I had in between all the writing really helped me get in a good frame of mind to do experiments next week because the cells will be ready next week. So maybe I need to reevaluate 30 hours. Maybe 30 hours is too much. Maybe a more realistic is like 15 or 20, which is bananas. I was feeling this way like 4 or 5 months ago, really strongly that I was behind and I was not going to make it. And now I'm celebrating meeting half of my goal for thesis writing. All of that to say is that this really does work when you give it the time and space to do so. And so in the show notes, I have a Google Doc that explains this in more detail and gives examples and prompts so that you can really start diving into this for yourself. But of course, if you stumbled upon here, if you're at the end of this episode, this means you're automatically not alone. You have me as a resource, so please leave a comment if you have a question, whether you have a question about how to implement or you started to implement and you're finding sticky spots or things that don't make sense, or if there's something in the front half of this episode you find really interesting, you want to learn more about, or you'd like more clarity on it, leave a comment below. You can also always DM me on Instagram at synaptic.sylvie. That's where I am the most active. And I'm really excited for you guys to start implementing this and to start experiencing the change, the really profound shift when you start tapping into your brain's reward system. And really the key thing we're doing here is we're training your brain on how to see things as a reward. And once that training happens, it's a really great positive snowball where your brain will start doing it automatically for you. Giving you a reward right now by celebrating you for being here. And I really look forward to diving into the next episode together. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.